And last but not least is the communicative competence model by Graby and Kaplan. Of course, like I said before, this is not originally produced by these guys. Originally, it comes from Canali and Swain, which was a development of Delheim's model and other scholars, and it was, a response to Chomsky's competence and performance model. Anyway, if you look at this structure, you see that the very famous structure of communicative competence underlying this framework of writing. It assumes that writing consists of the writer's intentions, goals, and attributes, and attributions and attitudes, linguistic knowledge, and this is very interesting because I think this makes it kind of useful for assessment purposes, because it articulates, for example, the knowledge of written code, knowledge of phonology, vocabulary, and so on and so forth. And that's something that raters most often look for when they are rating a piece of paper. Then discourse knowledge, like the intersentential and intersentential marking and devices, and knowledge of semantic relations, etc. And finally, social linguistic knowledge. So these three competencies, along with the writer's intentions, as well as the further audience considerations and knowledge of the world, together they help the authors, the writers, to produce a piece of paper. But how they do this, it's not very much specified and explained in this framework or taxonomy. Actually, it's pretty much like a taxonomy. The difference, as you know, the difference between a taxonomy and a model is that the model spells out the connections between the components, but here we don't see those connections. For a very good example of how these connections work together within a broader communicative competence, I think it would be a good idea to look at work done by Bachman and Palmer and Selamusha, as well as Canali and Swain's original paper. So I'm going to just summarize everything that I have discussed in the past 4 videos and in this current video. Writing is multi-componential, as you know, and lexicogrammatical knowledge is just one of the many components. Therefore, if you are a teacher who needs to assess and teach writing, do not put all your eggs into the basket of lexicogrammatical knowledge, because there are a lot of other components that you would need to pay attention to. And we should also remember that the way that our students use their lexicogrammatical knowledge could be affected by cognitive and social factors. And this is something that is predicted by Hayes' model. And therefore, the assessment rubrics that we develop has to be able to determine possible relationships between different components of writing and their impact of test scores. Right? So with these conclusions and necessary points discussed, I would like to move now to the assessment of writing itself. So for an assessment of writing, we need to have a theory, and I've been discussing some theories, and I should remind you that theories are not really limited to what I have been discussing. There are many other theories that you can use and adopt in your assessments. 2 is construct. That's our adaptation of the theory and customization of the theoretical frameworks in the context of assessment, in our context of assessment. And number 3 is, based on these 2, we need to develop a prompt or a task. Therefore, the prompt or a task that is developed is actually a representation of the construct or a theory. Number 4 is a rating scale. It's very I think, very obvious to many teachers, because a rating scale is basically that scale that you use in order to score the students. Some rating scales are pretty long and they're from 0 to 100, and that's quite confusing in my opinion. And some rating scales are shorter and probably easier to use and conducive to more reliable assessments. The example that crosses my mind is a rating scale that we used to use in the National University of Singapore in some of the mid-stakes tests of writing, a DET exam, that's Diagnostic English Test. And there's another exam, the name now, the name eludes me, I'm afraid. But for these two were diagnostic, they were mid-stakes tests. So we used a 3-category rating scale, which was from 1 to 3. So it was 1, 2, and 3, easy. And I think it was pretty easy for a lot of raters to remember what each means and to differentiate between level 1 and level 2. A rating scale also has a rubric, scoring rubric, that has got descriptors. For example, a scoring rubric which is based on an analytical assessment model would break down the writing ability into several components. I'll give you examples later. And we also need to remember that everything that has been said so far, from number 1 all the way to number 5, has to be clear enough to improve reliability of the scores as well as validity. For reliability here, I would like to stress that there are different types of reliability. One is rater, inter-rater reliability, the other one is intra-rater reliability, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to discuss them too much in this video at the interest of time. But just remember that in the modern theory of reliability uses the modern measurement theories, and in some cases you see that authors combine modern measurement theory and inter or intra-rater reliability analyses. It's just to make sure that the scores are not affected, test scores or assessment scores are not affected by sources such as rater, severity, or leniency, and so on and so forth. So here is a representation which I got from one of the papers I published a long time ago. As you see, the examiner is right in this box. The examiner is right at the center. What contributes to the examiner's performance are those 3 pieces of knowledge which or competencies which I mentioned before, which are predicted by the communicative competence model. There's linguistic knowledge, discourse knowledge, and social linguistic knowledge, plus other factors that were predicted by Kaplan and Grabe. Then this leads to a production. That's the text. But the production, I'm afraid, has to go through a filter, which is represented by this triangle. And that filter is all facets that affect the tests, the performance of the examinee, which include the task itself and the features, because that affect the examinee. This is pretty much like the environment factor in Hayes model. And these two, which are not predicted by any of the previous model which we have discussed, but they are very important in assessment. The severity of the judge, or the characteristics and predispositions of the judge or the rater, as well as the rating criteria. I'm afraid these are very important, and they can affect the performance of the examinee in ways that we cannot even predict. In the end, the performance is summarized in the form of a test score. And in Messick and Mike Kane's framework of validation, the whole enterprise of validity and validation is about the validation of the interpretations and uses of test scores. I think in another video I will discuss that in more details, because I think that's a whole different idea, different kind of ideas which will fall outside of the scope of this presentation. but I should stress that it's important to establish the reliability and validity of the uses and interpretations of test scores.